Hello, everybody. Good evening, good day, everyone. I hope you're all doing very well. And thank you for being on the 143rd episode of the Ask Abhijit show. I hope the image is good. So here we are. So before we begin, as always, let me see who all is there with us. I can see Chiching, Karthik, Ayan, Vitamin Protein, Kishan, Kushal, Sushil, Avneet, Rajiv, Nikhil, Siddhant Singh Chauhan, Bharata Paksha, Nandan, Durga, good evening, PK, Kaustub, Debjit, Krutarth, Jeet, Jenil, Clipper, Flipper, Vladimir, Adityanath, Ankush Nath, YK, Mr. Giga Chad of India, Chiang's World, Yash Bharadwaj 059, Eternal Light, Shiva Prasad, Nikhil, Nero, Saddam Hussein is here with us, Avneet Singh Khurana, Aditya again, Mona Lisa, Anthony Mack, Bharat Paksh, the Colt God, Roshan Riker, Angshuman, PK, Anudeep, Vaibhav, Mr. Nobody, Sushil, Vishant, Pratyush, Sachit, Dude, Sayan, Lage Raho Online, Kishan, Jeet Roy Chaudhary, Samudra Das, Dungar Singh Chauhan, Nikhil Kumar, Jay Chatralia, Akshay, Aryan, Sahil, XP, Abhay, Nish, Dilip, Debjit, Haripriya, Vaibhav, Sampati, and lots of other people. Good Manmat Tiwari, Captain X, Debjit, and lots of other people. Good evening, good day to all of you. Thank you so much for being on the show. So today we will obviously I will take questions from the comments that you have posted in the comments. I hope the image is fine. Yesterday I apologize for yesterday there were some technical issues, there was some lag and all that. Today I have a whole different setup. I have a different service, internet service provider, different broadband, different laptop, new laptop and all. So hopefully things are better, things will go better today. I hope the image is clear. I've tried to replicate the same image as I had before. So I hope everything goes fine today, right? So with that said, let us get into the questions. What questions do we have today? Okay, let's take the first one by Amit. Amit says very C-grade performance, very C-grade performance by the Russian army. They were gaining ground, attacking, but only by destroying cities, and so on and so forth. So it's about Kharkiv, it's about Kherson. So the overall sentiment is that the Russians are losing. They're doing very poorly, and that's what many people seem to be thinking. And it makes sense to think that way because the Russians withdrew from Kharkiv, the Russians withdrew from Kherson. So what's happening? So let us revisit this one more time. Let's take a look at the map. So somebody was very kind enough to send me a good map of Ukraine on Twitter. I usually use an interactive map, but let's take a look at this map. I don't know who the person is, but thank you very much, sir or ma'am, for sending this map. This is a very good color coded map, and it will help us understand the thing better, the situation better. So this is an older map. You can see that the Crimean Republic is shown as part of Ukraine. It is no longer part of Ukraine. It was annexed by the Russians in 2014. The four Crimean oblasts or republic, the four Ukrainian oblasts or republics that have been annexed by Russia are Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, right? The four southeastern ones. Now, the situation is that the Russians a few months ago withdrew from Kharkiv, right? Kharkiv is the city over here in the north. They withdrew from it. They withdrew from Kharkiv. And recently, just a few days ago, they withdrew from north of the Dnieper River in the Kherson Oblast. So they evacuated Kherson city for several months before this happened, for several weeks before this happened, and then they withdrew from the right bank of the Dnieper River, which is the northwest of the Kherson province. That is what happened, right? So what they did before they withdrew is they evacuated all the Russian-speaking people from that region. See, the Kherson region is Russian majority, and that's why the Russians have annexed it. But they evacuated all the Russian ethnicity people, the Russian-speaking people from that region for several weeks, and only then they withdrew from the region because they knew what the Ukrainians would otherwise do to the Russian speakers, because we know what they've been doing to the Russian speakers since 2014. So the Russians did this first, and then they withdrew from that part of Kherson province. And I had said when the news first came in that there are three possibilities of what's really happening. The first possibility is that NATO is winning. This is a proxy war between Russia and NATO. Ukraine is the proxy. So the first possibility is that NATO is winning and Russia is losing. That's why they were thrown out of Kharkiv, and they were forced to evacuate from that part of Kherson, right? So if that is true, if this possibility is the correct possibility, if this is the right thing, then you will see that the Ukrainians will try to cross the river and try to move into the other part, the Russian occupied part of Kherson province, which is south of the river Dnieper, and they may even try to make a move on Crimea. So if NATO is winning, if the Russians have been thrown out, then this is what's going to happen. But it's not happened thus far. So what's the second possibility? The second possibility I said is that there are negotiations going on secretly for a ceasefire, and the Russian withdrawal from this part of Kherson is maybe a prerequisite for the ceasefire, and maybe something will happen during the G20 summit or right after the G20 summit, immediately after it. Well, the G20 summit came and went this week, and nothing was announced, and nothing, there's been no move in that direction either. And the third possibility I said is that the Russians are laying a nasty trap for NATO. So they will withdraw from this region, let the Ukrainian forces, NATO forces, come into the Kherson city, and then they will obliterate it. Well, even that has not happened. The Ukrainians are not stupid. They also sense that there could be this sort of nasty surprise waiting for them. So they have not moved into Kherson city in big numbers. Yes, they have taken the city, of course, and so on. They've so-called liberated the city, and that's what's happening. So I had put forth three possibilities. NATO winning is one. Second is ceasefire negotiations happening in secret. And third, nasty trap for NATO. Well, thus far, we have seen nothing happening. Neither possibility A, nor possibility B, nor possibility C. So what is happening? What is happening? And, I am sure there is a lot of anger in Russia as well about, first of all, the withdrawal from Kharkiv, and secondly, then this new withdrawal from north of the Dnieper River in the Kherson region. I am sure there is a great deal of anger and resentment among the Russian population. And in Russia, when you have a de facto dictator who's ruling the country, this sort of resentment is very dangerous. It is very dangerous. It can lead to the downfall of the leader, Mr. Putin, if he becomes deeply unpopular. If he is seen to have failed, and yet he willingly withdrew his forces from Kharkiv, and he willingly withdrew his forces from Kherson. So what's happening? What's happening? There is a fourth possibility. I believe that the Russians are waiting for winter. It's still not winter. If you Google the weather in Kiev right now, you will see it's 0 degrees or minus 1, -2 thereabouts. Yep. So it's late autumn. It's already becoming really cold. It's already touching the 0 degrees mark and going into the negative temperatures. Yes, but it's not winter yet. When is winter really there? Winter is really there in full force when the ground freezes. When the ground freezes. When the rivers freeze over. The rivers don't necessarily have to freeze over, but the ground needs to freeze. All the muddy, boggy patches of ground all over Ukraine. Ukraine is extremely flat. It's flat like a pancake. There are no hills, there are no mountains. It's flat, flat, flat. And there are places where you have mud, there are places you have bog and all that. All that, in winter, it freezes. It becomes solid. I believe the Russians are waiting for that to happen. And right now, what they are doing is they have pulled out their forces from Kharkiv, from Kherson. They are reconfiguring their forces. They have also recruited more people and all that. And they are waiting for the ground to freeze. They are waiting for General Winter to make his arrival into Novorossiya, into Ukraine. And I believe once that happens, there will be a major push forward, military push forward. The Russian people will not tolerate any perceived loss by the Russian armed forces, right? So it is a significant possibility, in my opinion, that the Russians are merely waiting. They are withdraw. This is the tactical withdrawal. They are waiting for the ground to freeze, and then there will be a major push forward. So by mid-December, perhaps, you could see a major upsurge in military activity and major push forward by the Russian forces. They have until now withheld significant portions of their military. The Air Force has hardly been involved at all. It is being kept in reserve for the future big war. And there's a whole lot more to come. So I think there is a possibility, number 4, that within a month's time, maybe in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whenever the ground freezes, the Russians will push forward, big push forward, massive push forward. And that could essentially change the map of Ukraine forever. and NATO knows that. Because why do I say NATO knows that? I say this because, let me put something on the screen, because of this. This is from the Washington Post. It's from November 5. Today is November 20. That's like 2 weeks ago. The US privately asks Ukraine to show it's open to negotiate with Russia. Yeah. So over here, it's being said that the encouragement is not aimed at pushing Ukraine to the negotiating table, but ensuring it maintains a moral high ground in the eyes of international backers and so on. But the Americans are asking Ukraine to privately to show that it's open to negotiate. Maybe there are negotiations that are happening. We don't know. Maybe there are. These things are not announced until it's a fait accompli. Yeah. So I think there is a significant possibility that the Russian withdrawal from Kharkiv, from Kherson, etc., it's a tactical withdrawal. It's like a chess move in which you pull back for a while. Maybe sometimes you may even sacrifice a pawn or a chess piece here and there, and then you do what you are really planning to do. So I think, I may be wrong, of course, but I think in 2 to 3 weeks, maybe by mid-December, when the ground is totally frozen, you will see a major offensive that will change the whole dynamics of the war. Major Russian offensive. So let's see. I'm putting this out in the open. Let's see if I'm right. Let's see if I'm wrong. Time will tell us. By mid-December, I think this could happen, or maybe by the latest by the end of December. I don't think the Russians will wait. Once the ground is properly frozen, I don't think they'll wait. They're going to push. So let's see if this is the case, and they have the ability to overrun significant portions of Ukraine in very less time. Especially if the Air Force gets involved. In that case, they can annihilate the resistance from the NATO-backed Ukrainian proxy forces. So that is what could be in the offing. That's what could come very soon. Let's wait and watch, and let's see if I'm right or if I will be proven wrong. All right. Okay. Next question. Harsh Agarwal says, do you think Trump will come back as president of the US? I'm assuming. And can India and Indians really trust Donald Trump? I heard in an interview with a foreign US national security advisor that if the Chinese give him assurance on votes, he will side with the Chinese. What's my take? I don't think Donald Trump is a traitor to his country. Siding with the Chinese means betraying your own nation. I don't think Donald Trump is that sort of a person. Obviously, he has business dealings worldwide, including with China. What's wrong with that? I am sure the other side also has plenty of people, including at very high positions, who have all kinds of dealings with China. I think we know about that. I'm not going to speak about it, but I think you all know what I mean. So it's perfectly fine to have legal, legitimate business dealings with nations like China, with Russia, with India, with whoever else you want. What's wrong with that? But I do not think that Donald Trump will betray his nation in exchange for an assurance of votes. I don't know what interview you're talking about. I'm not sure which NSA you're referring to. But if somebody is saying that Donald Trump will side with China if the Chinese give him assistance with votes, you are essentially saying that the Chinese are capable of interfering with the electoral process of the US. Until now, they've been saying Russia, Russia, Russia. Now they're saying that you are essentially alleging that Donald Trump will betray his country in exchange for Chinese interference in elections. I think that is incredibly stupid if somebody has actually said that. I personally have not heard about it. So that's point number one. I don't think Donald Trump will betray his nation and side with China in exchange for Chinese interference in the electoral process of the US. Okay, so that's number one. Do I think Donald Trump will come back in 2024? Time will tell us. I think it's unlikely. I know it's not a popular thing to say. Lots of Indians are big fans of Mr. Trump. I think it's unlikely that Donald Trump will come back. Why do I say this? Because he is an outsider in US politics. He came in as an outsider and managed to secure the Republican nomination for presidency in 2016. It was a shock to the Republican Party. All the seasoned politicians, they all sound the same. They talk a lot without saying anything. Donald Trump came in and grabbed the entire process by the throat, and he was very popular with the Republicans, with the population, the voters, and that's how he was able to win the Republican nomination. And then he was able to defeat who was it? Hillary Clinton, right? So he's an outsider. There are people within his own party who don't like the fact that this businessman, this business tycoon, came in and shoved them all aside and became so popular. There are plenty of he has plenty of opponents within his own party. And secondly, the overall electoral system in the US, whether it's Republicans or whether it's Democrats, they both hate him. It's a bipartisan dislike of Donald Trump. They don't want this sort of thing to ever happen again, that an outsider, a non-politician, manages to enter politics and wins. It's bad for business. Politics is deeply linked to business and money. Yeah, it's bad for business if a non-politician becomes president. So Donald Trump, we know he has already announced his candidacy for the 2024 Republican nomination for presidency. Yeah, and he has challenges like Ron DeSantis and various other people. Some new names may come up in the future, in the coming months. Yeah. Uh, but I think there's going to be a significant amount of resistance from within his party. And even if he manages to secure once again the Republican nomination, there could be, I mean, the Democrats will try to make life hell for him. Yeah. Of course, he is now back on Twitter. He hasn't tweeted yet. Elon Musk has reinstated Donald Trump's Twitter account, which was cancelled in 2020, early 2020. So yeah, that's he's a very entertaining person on Twitter, and he knows how to keep people focused on him. So he has a lot of advantages that other politicians don't have. As a politician, you need to have personality. Other politicians all look and sound the same. And of course, you need to know what you're doing. You need to understand the issues that people are facing, and you need to be able to provide genuine solutions, or you need to be able to convince the people that you have the solutions and you will be able to implement those solutions. Donald Trump has done that in the past. But yeah, I think he faces significant challenges when it comes to the 2024 election. Firstly, from within his own party. If he succeeds in that, then he will face the entire media in the US. I would say that 90% of the US media is controlled by the Democrats. And public opinion is easy to sway through social media and through the mainstream media. If you keep saying the same things over and over and over again, and not just one person but the entire media machinery, it's very easy to influence people's minds. People are very gullible. People don't understand things. Unfortunately, that's how it is. So I think it's difficult for Donald Trump. Yeah. So that's the point number 2, that I think it will be very hard for him to come back. Can India and Indians really trust him? We can trust Donald Trump to, if he does come to power in 2024, we can trust him to pursue his national interest and his self-interest. You can't trust him beyond that. He's not going to serve India. If he does become president, his duty will be to serve his nation. America first, like he says, make America great again. That's always been his campaign slogan. That's always been his platform, his plank, that I'm here to make America great again. So if India can create that sort of relationship with him, in which we say that, we will help you make your country great again. What do you need from us? And what can we get in return? If we have that sort of relationship and that sort of negotiating platform, it will work well. So we can trust him to try and fulfill his campaign promises, to make America great again, and all those things. You can't trust him to favor your nation. If you want him to favor your nation, you have to give him something in return. That's how it goes, right? So to that extent, we can certainly trust him. So that's what I think about this. I do not believe that he is somebody who will betray his nation in favor of the Chinese. Yeah, that's I don't think so. I don't believe that at all. Secondly, I think it will be very hard for him to come back. It will be much harder than in 2016. And thirdly, we can trust him to want to fulfill and to do his best to fulfill his campaign promises if he is re-elected. And if India can help him in that aspect, in that matter, then it will be mutually beneficial for India and the US. Yeah. But overall, we know that he has been, of all the recent US presidents, he was the one who was the most favorably inclined towards India. I mean, if you talk about George W. Bush, if you talk about Barack Obama, if you talk about Mr. Biden, and if you talk about Trump, I mean, these are the 4 more recent ones, the 21st century presidents, more or less. Yeah. So yeah, he has been the one that was the most favorably inclined among all of these. If you go back one more presidency, Clinton was very much pro-Pakistan, right? Bill Clinton, I'm talking about. So Trump would be very much open to negotiate with India, and work in mutually constructive and beneficial ways. So that in that sense it could be good for India. But I think Indians should not hope too much that he will be re-elected. It's going to be a hard climb for him. Um, he has already been demonized to the high heavens, or to the depths of hell, by the American media. But of course, he was able to win the Twitter poll, whether he should be reinstated or not. So that he does seem still to have a lot of popularity. He still is the biggest face in the Republican Party. So he has some advantages, but he also has a steep climb ahead of him. So that's where it is. And let's see how it goes. But we should always keep our options open. Okay, Rohan Dwivedi says, what's your take on the handshake between Prime Minister Modi and modern day Mao of China? Is there going to be some normalcy in the relationship between India and China? Manmat says, Xi Jinping and Modi ji finally shook hands at the G20 summit in Bali. What future do India-China relations hold in the upcoming years? Look, let me say this all over one more time. I will keep saying this. India cannot trust China. The Chinese are a hegemonic, expansionist, imperialist power. Right? That's the core focus of the Chinese Communist Party, to make China the number one nation in the world at the expense of everybody else. They don't want a bipolar world. They don't want a multipolar world. They want a unipolar world with China at the center. China is the imperial power. Everybody else is their vassal. Everybody else comes and pays tribute to China. That is the envisioned world order, and that's their worldview. That's the kind of world they would like to create. Now they have faced setbacks of late. The coronavirus crisis has been a disaster for China. It's still a big problem in China. They still have this zero lockdown policy and all that. So their rise to ascendancy has been greatly delayed. They still hope that they will replace the US as the sole superpower, but it's still just a hope. The Belt and Road Initiative, which was supposed to be the vehicle that takes China there, has kind of stalled. But they would like to restart it with the help of BRICS plus, expanded BRICS and all that. Yeah, so that's the situation. Yeah. So it is also good for India if there is a new emerging world order. We don't want a Chinese dominated unipolar world order. We want a multipolar world order. A multipolar world order in which there are multiple sources, centers of power, multiple poles: India, China, Russia, the US led bloc, the Western bloc, and so on. Maybe we would like some nations in Africa also to step up if it's possible to free them from Western colonization and all that. So India seeks a multipolar world. And how do you make such a multipolar world come about? Well, the most important factor, or the most important vehicle that India can use for creating a multipolar world order would be BRICS plus, because now more than a dozen nations have stated that they want to join BRICS. Many nations have actually applied officially. Indonesia applied this week at the G20 summit to join BRICS. Other nations have also applied. So BRICS is a block that's going to expand. It's going to be BRICS plus. It will still be called BRICS. We cannot keep on adding letters of the alphabet to it, but it's going to be called BRICS plus or BRICS plus plus, whatever it is. By 2025, 2026, you could have maybe 5-6 more nations that are members of BRICS, maybe more. We will see how it goes. The Saudis want to join. So G20, we had this G20 summit, right? G20 has been hijacked by the US and the G7 nations. If you look at the wording of the final statement of the G20 summit, you can see there's so much references to Russia and Ukraine and war, which has nothing to do with the other nations. So it's been hijacked by the G7 nations, especially by the US. The G7s are all US vassals. I keep using this word vassal, but it's something that you will see lots of other major publications also starting to use nowadays. All right. So G20 has been hijacked by the US. I mean, what business does Ursula von der Leyen have being at the G20 summit? The EU is not a member of G20. Individual nations are members of G20. There are 20 nations, and yet all these things are imported into G20 and so on. So the core nations of G20, especially the Eastern nations, the Asian nations, I I can assure you they do not like this. They do not like their G20 organization being co-opted and hijacked in this manner. Yeah, they also have their own national interests to pursue. They would like there to be more trade, more interoperationality, more cooperation between especially the so-called global south and the eastern nations. So for that they have ASEAN, they also have other things as well. So the focus will now move more towards that. And they will also now want to be part of BRICS, because BRICS has nothing to do with the G7 nations or NATO or the EU or the US. So that's where they will feel more comfortable. That's where they see enormous potential for growth and progress. So that's why BRICS is becoming more and more attractive to these nations. But BRICS is a non starter if the two major nations within BRICS, their leaders can't even talk to each other. We have these tensions with China, the undemarcated border, the Chinese occupied Tibet, which they occupied in the 1950s, and the Chinese claims on Indian territory, and the recent military clashes, the Galwan clashes, or the other the salami slicing tactics of China, trying to encroach here and there all the time, constantly. This is a major point of friction. It could even lead to a war in the future. If this situation continues, BRICS is a non starter. BRICS cannot be a viable organization. And India understands that. The Chinese also understand that. And that's why it looks like there's been some diplomacy behind the scenes. And it was agreed that India and China, the leaders, will meet, albeit briefly, just for a couple of minutes, just a brief greeting, some pleasantries, a few words exchanged, and that's it. In full view of the world, in public, at the G20 official dinner, whatever that event was. So that was a message to the nations that want to join BRICS, that we can make things work. You don't need to worry about it, right? Because it is good for India if BRICS expands and like-minded nations join. It's also good for China. They would like to use BRICS for their own purposes, of course. They would like to restart the BRI, the Belt and Road thing. Yeah, and they could use BRICS to kickstart it. But it's also good for India that more influence and more power comes towards BRICS. Rather, it's all, the entire world is right now under the stranglehold of the West. Everything, the so-called rules-based world order, the whims-based world order. So we would like to see a parallel system emerging, which is more in our favor. Of course, the Chinese will be involved. Of course, the Russians are involved. We can trust Russia. India and Russia have no friction points whatsoever. But China is the problem that Russia and India don't trust. But we will have to find a way to work together. And that's the reason why the handshake happened. It doesn't mean things are going to be normal. I would still be surprised if the Chinese agree to actually uh, finally demarcate the India-Tibet border. That entire process will take a few years, but it's never started. They have these endless rounds of meetings between India and China in which nothing, no progress ever happens. The Chinese are doing this deliberately. They're deliberately stalling this. They have no interest in demarcating the border. Well, I think India will have to negotiate with the Chinese hard. India will have to play hardball that if you do want this thing to go forward, BRICS, if you do want normalcy in BRICS, if you want BRICS to be a viable organization, these are the non-negotiable conditions. So maybe there is some progress perhaps happening in that matter. We don't know. Negotiations, diplomacy always happens in secret. Negotiations always happen in secret. Maybe something is happening, maybe something is not. We don't know. Assuming it's happening, we hope that things can get better. But we have to always remember that we cannot trust China. Right? So maybe things are getting better. Maybe India-China relations will improve. But even if they do improve, we have to always be wary. China is much more powerful militarily and economically. We have to ensure that we catch up with them. So that's got to be the main focus. India ideally needs another 20 years without any major conflict, major war. Then we can deal with the world. Yeah. So that is our focus, and BRICS will help us go in the direction. If we can maintain some kind of normalcy, even fake normalcy with China, it will be great. Next 20 years. So that's what's happening. That is the future of India-China relations. There could still be war. Who knows? If the Chinese so decide, India will not initiate any war. But if the Chinese so decide, if Xi Jinping and his Communist Party minions so decide, then there could be something. But hopefully there will be more normalcy and less friction. That would be good for the whole world. I'm sure the Chinese also understand this. So let's see how it goes. But I think things could get better, and let's hope so. Okay, three questions. Rishi says India just took over the G20 presidency. Yes. Our government has hinted that the next summit is to be held in Srinagar. Pakistan is expected to make some noise. We will face some real problems in hosting it in Sri Lanka. Srinagar. Is it geopolitically beneficial for us to host it there? Manmat says G20 summit 2023 is most likely to be held in JNK. Pakistan is a nobody, but what significance will this act have upon China? Is China also occupies a big part of that region of India? Raghav says India is planning to keep G20 meet of commerce ministers in Kashmir. What do you think will be the geopolitical consequences of the same? Okay, so most likely, so even I've been hearing this for the past few months that maybe the next G20 summit or some part of it, some portion of it, will be held in Kashmir, maybe in Ladakh, maybe in Srinagar, somewhere else, but in Kashmir, right? In Jammu and Kashmir. So what does this mean? So Pakistan, like you say, is a nobody. Pakistan doesn't matter. They can howl to the heavens, they can protest, they can complain, doesn't make any difference. There's nothing they can do about this, right? So if India holds the summit or some portion of it in Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, or in Ladakh, or some portion of that region, what does it mean? What are we doing? What do we mean? What are the signals that we are sending? And to whom are we sending those signals? The first signal that India will be sending is that Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh are integral and inalienable parts of India. That's the first thing. And this signal is essentially being sent to two forces or two nations, China and the US and the West. The West is essentially all controlled and owned by the US. The Americans portray Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh as disputed territory. Right? The Americans have been doing this for the past 60, 70 years. They portray it as a disputed territory. So if India holds the summit there, it's an assertion to the Americans that this is Indian territory. And then the Americans will also have to come and attend. So if they do come and attend, it means they're assenting and they're agreeing to the fact that this is Indian territory, symbolically. Yeah, they might not say it in those words, but they are coming to JNK or Ladakh and being part of the G20 summit there, which means that they are on Indian territory, and they, just by being there, they are symbolically recognizing that fact. The same goes to China. The Chinese portray JNK and Ladakh, etc., Gilgit-Baltistan and all that as a disputed territory. The Chinese occupy a part of JNK, the Shaksgam Valley. Yes. So, which was part of POK, and the Pakistanis then illegally gave that portion of Ladakh to the Chinese, the Shaksgam Valley region. So the Chinese are in occupation of our territory, not just Aksai Chin, but also the Shaksgam Valley. Of course, they also occupy Aksai Chin, and they portray the entirety of JNK and Ladakh and all that as disputed territory. So if we hold the G20 summit there, the Chinese will also have to come. The Xi Jingping will have to come, right, and attend the summit. And if he does that, it's a de facto symbolic recognition of the fact that this is Indian territory. He may not say it, but that's how it goes. So it is going to be a geopolitically a big statement and symbolism that this is Indian territory. And the whole world now comes here and recognizes the fact. So if we do it, which we should, it will be great. So that's the reason why, if it is going to happen, it's going to happen. It's going to happen in Jammu and Kashmir or Ladakh or wherever it is, the final decision is taken. If it is Srinagar, great, wonderful. So the question is, that's why it's a good thing. It will be geopolitically beneficial for us to host it there. What significance will this act have upon China? Like I said, that's what it will mean for China as well. It will be a statement to them, and the fact that they do come and attend means that they are also recognizing the fact that this is part of Indian territory. So that's what it is. Now, what about the security situation? Will there be any security problems? Well, if there is any security problem, if there is any potential security risk, that risk will only come from Pakistan because it's right next door. It occupies part of JNK, and also Gilgit-Baltistan, right, which is part of. So that is illegally occupied by Pakistan, and they have this history of fomenting terrorism in JNK. So if there is anything whatsoever which could happen, terrorism or any security issue, it can only be via Pakistan. And obviously, the Pakistanis will be forewarned. They'll be told, if anything goes wrong, doesn't matter who does it, we're gonna blame you and we're gonna make you pay the price for it. So that's a guarantee. So the Pakistanis will know that when this big G20 meeting summit is happening, if anything whatsoever happens, even if it's not your fault, we're gonna blame you. So I'm sure they will be made to behave, and because see, this government knows how to make Pakistan behave. Before 2014, there were terrorist attacks in India almost every week. There's this whole list you can find on various websites, including Wikipedia. Dozens, hundreds of terrorist attacks in India before 2014. Every week, almost every day in some part of India. After 2014, everything ends. Everything stopped. Because this government has a very hardline policy against terrorism. Of course, you had one or two incidents like the Uri attack, which was avenged brutally. And then there was the other thing as well. So the Pakistanis were made to understand that we're going to take very severe action against you. The surgical strikes and the Balakot airstrike were two examples of that, and we can escalate it much further. So the Pakistanis know that they can play with fire. So I think it will go off safely, securely. If anything happens, the Pakistanis will be made to pay a very, very heavy price for it. So I'm sure they will not do any nonsense, any mischief. So that's about the possibility of the G20 summit, the next one, the 2023 G20 summit happening in maybe Srinagar, maybe somewhere in J&K and Ladakh. That'll be great. I think we should do that. Akshay says Saudi Crown Prince Salman, Mohammed bin Salman's actions in recent developments like expressing interest to join BRICS, giving special waiver like removing police verification requirements for Saudi visa for Indians and other military and strategic cooperation with India, and wanting to get away from the Western Bloc. Are we seeing Saudi Arabia as an important player in the current geopolitical world order? Very good question. Very good question. Let's take a look at the map. Now, I don't have a separate map for Saudi Arabia, so we will go to the map that I always use. Let's take a look at Saudi Arabia from the perspective of geography. So India is here, as we all know, in the center of the screen. You go westwards, you have the Arabian Peninsula. Our nearest maritime neighbor is Oman. Then you have Yemen, and if you go further west, you have Saudi Arabia after crossing the UAE. So Saudi Arabia is not really very far from us. It's obviously it's the world's largest producer, if I'm not mistaken, of petroleum products, oil, gas, all that, mainly oil, yes. And that's why it is prosperous, and that's why it is geopolitically incredibly important and significant, and that's why the Americans have so much of an interest in Saudi Arabia. So this entire nation was carved out of the chaos in the aftermath of the so-called First World War, which was the first European tribal war. Yes, and this nation state was established by this kingdom was established by the British. And later on, after the decline of the British Empire and the transference of power from London to Washington, the Americans became the major patrons of Saudi Arabia, and they have propped up this dynasty, the House of Saud, and they are the major beneficiaries. They have been the major beneficiaries of oil from this region. Now the Americans are a major oil producer through fracking, through shale oil, all that. So, and yet Saudi Arabia is a major nation because it contributes a significant amount of the oil that is consumed globally, and it has a very big say in the oil prices. The amount of production that it does has a direct impact on the oil prices in the world. It is obviously the major nation in the OPEC plus group, which is the cartel of petroleum exporting countries. Now, India and Saudi Arabia, the past 6-7 years, ever since Mr. Modi came to power, the relations between India and Saudi Arabia ever since have been excellent. Mr. Modi has made it a point to ensure that India and Saudi Arabia and other nations in the Gulf region have excellent relations, right? Even the UAE, even Oman, India even has a couple of military bases, if I'm not mistaken. Let's not talk about it here. But yes, we have excellent cooperation with Oman, with the UAE, excellent relations, and with Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis are most likely, if I'm not mistaken, India's number one or number two supplier of oil. Yes. Now, recently, what happened is before the midterm elections, inflation was rising in the US. Gasoline prices were had risen significantly, and Joe Biden requested the Saudis to ramp up oil production so that the prices will go down and he will win the election. He even visited Saudi Arabia, but the Saudis refused, and they cut down. Instead of increasing oil production, they cut oil production by 2%, which caused a certain amount of surging, a certain percentage increase in the oil prices worldwide, which is something the Americans, I can assure you, are greatly annoyed about. That is a bad thing from their perspective. Our vassal state is refusing to obey our orders. What on earth is happening? That's not good from their perspective. So that is a red mark against Mohammed bin Salman from the American perspective. Now Mohammed bin Salman is saying that he wants to join BRICS. That essentially for the Americans is like their vassal state saying that I will now no longer obey you and I will go and join the enemy camp. That's essentially what it means from the US perspective. That is a very dangerous game that Mohammed bin Salman is playing. He's a very brave man. And clearly he wants to wean away his nation from the US influence. The thing is this: today there are US troops on Saudi territory, more or less permanently stationed there. You can look it up what the numbers are, where the US military bases are. And the Saudis, they buy significant quantities of US weaponry every year. The Saudis have one of the top 5 military budgets in the world, if I'm not mistaken. I think the top 5, it's in the top 5, and they exclusively buy US weaponry. So it's heavily dependent on the US from that perspective. It's a US client state, it's a US puppet state, it's a US vassal state. It's been that for a very long time. Now Mohammed bin Salman wants to take his nation out of the clutches of the empire, of the superpower. And these are all steps that he is taking in that direction. Not obeying the US diktat to ramp up oil production. Instead, he's cutting oil production. That is a sign of rebellion. Then expressing his intent, his willingness, his desire to join BRICS. That is an even bigger act of rebellion. Yes. And this great closeness with India, giving various waivers to Indians for acquiring Saudi visas. There's no more any need for police verification. Yeah, so these are all steps that bring the two nations closer. Though India is a nation that the US would want to make their vassal state, but India is steadfastly refused. That we will not bow to your diktats and we will not, become another Japan. So India has an independent foreign policy. The Saudis want to create an independent foreign policy, and that's what we are seeing. That these steps are in that direction. If the Saudis succeed, if Mohammed bin Salman succeeds in taking Saudi Arabia out of the clutches of the empire, or even partially out of the clutches, and become a member of BRICS, and if he succeeds in surviving this transition period, this pivot, then Saudi Arabia could become a significantly important player in the Middle East and in the overall geopolitical world order. It's a difficult thing to do. Why is it difficult? Because BRICS, before Saudi Arabia, Iran has applied to join BRICS. If you study some history, you will realize that Saudi Arabia and Iran are essentially like enemies. They have a very fraught relationship. They have a very hostile relationship. Saudi Arabia and Iran. These are more or less enemy nations. So if Saudi Arabia has to join BRICS, they will have to make some kind of peace with Iran. It's possible, but it's complicated. Yeah. So that's one obstacle in the way. But I'm sure if India and China can possibly perhaps make things work, I'm sure Saudi Arabia and Iran can also possibly perhaps make things work. But the main problem is the overlord, the United States, the empire, the superpower. Will Mohammed bin Salman succeed in achieving this transition, this pivot to the East? He would like to become part of the East, the Eastern Bloc, not the Western Bloc. Will the Americans allow him to do this? I can assure you the Americans will throw everything, will use every lever, every asset that they have at their disposal to stop Mohammed bin Salman from transitioning, from pivoting to the East. You will, I am pretty sure very soon you will start seeing all kinds of articles in the English speaking media, the global media, about how bad and brutal and unjust of a ruler Mohammed bin Salman is, how undemocratic he is, what sort of atrocities are being done in Saudi Arabia against LGBTQ plus people. What is the situation, the position of women in Saudi society, how downtrodden it is, and how despotic and brutal and evil of a dictator Mohammed bin Salman is. Obviously, the Jamal Khashoggi case is there. They can always bring that out, right? I can sense this coming very soon if Mohammed bin Salman persists in steering his nation eastwards. So it will start like that, and then they will use every other means at their disposal, including regime change. So I would say that if Mohammed bin Salman is determined to do this, he must have done some very tough and hard calculations, and he must have come to the conclusion that he is in a position to actually succeed, maybe try and do this, and he will obviously have to look out for his own personal safety. Yeah. So it's a very bold move that he is making. It is a very dangerous thing that he's doing, going up against the overlord, and it could be very dangerous for me. We know what happens to US puppets who turn their backs on the US and try to become independent. Iraq tried to do that. They tried to suddenly create their own independent foreign policy. Yeah, that's what Saddam Hussein tried to do. We know what happened to him, and there are many more examples. So yeah, I even hear that Xi Jinping is due to visit Riyadh very soon, maybe in a week, maybe in a month or so. Yeah, he's scheduled to visit Riyadh. So yeah, that could be a move in that direction, that Saudi Arabia wants to become part of BRICS. And since China is the number one nation in the BRICS group, he will have to run it past Xi Jinping. So maybe that's what's happening. Yeah. So Xi Jinping is personally going to visit Riyadh. Xi Jinping usually doesn't travel much. He recently went to Bali. Now he is going to imminently soon visit Riyadh. So there will be something happening there. So, and then Saudi Arabia will have to make good with Iran in some way. Find a working relationship, a way of cooperating, a way of lessening the tensions, and so on. So yeah, it's a complicated situation. It's a complicated scenario that we're witnessing. Global geopolitics right now is very complicated, and there's a whole lot of realignment happening. But overall, if Mohammed bin Salman is able to somehow successfully pull this off, then Saudi Arabia will become a major addition to the Eastern Bloc, to the BRICS bloc, and it could become a major player in geopolitics. But it is a very dangerous thing. The Middle East has been in crisis for decades. It's all being the strings are all being pulled from the West. They have created these artificial lines of conflict, of tensions, sectarian tensions, national tensions, and all that. And they could pull off something else. So you could see things getting really bad in the Middle East. Maybe next year. This year is the year of the Ukraine war. Maybe 2023 will be the year of tensions and crisis in the Middle East. I may be wrong. Maybe I'll be right. Let's see how 2023 goes. I think 2023 the focus will be on the Middle East and on Saudi Arabia and on BRICS, and not so much on Ukraine. Let's see how it goes. Okay, the next question is by Daniel Nicholson. The US Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen, released a statement that India could buy as much oil from Russia as it wants, along the lines of the price cap mechanism. While somebody from the Indian side said that we do not have to follow the price cap regulations. How is this shaping the new consumer-seller relations between India and Russia? And is the US resigned to Indian adamancy over crude oil procurement from Russia? So yes, the Americans were insisting that, see, this price cap, we don't know what it is. It's not been announced yet. Maybe it will be announced in a week, maybe 2 weeks, definitely in December, by December, by mid-December, whenever it is announced, it will be soon. So they want to impose a price cap on Russian oil. They want to decide what is the highest price at which the Russians can sell their oil. Yeah, and they want India. They were saying that they want India to abide by the American price cap on Russian oil. Means don't pay more than this much amount to the Russians for the oil you purchase from them. India said no. Now India kept saying no, we will not do this. We will buy oil from Russia at discounted rates, and it's between India and Russia. It's nothing to do with the US. You will not dictate to us what we do. That's what India's position has been throughout. Now the Americans are saying, okay, India does not have to abide by with the price cap. Go buy as much as you want. But the problem is this: India does not have a fleet of oil tankers. India, for the past 70 years, has not bothered to invest in a major fleet of oil super tankers, which means that India, for more than 90% of its oil imports, has to depend on oil tankers, ships that belong to other nations. Now, whenever you're doing this, you need what's called insurance. And there are some other things as well. And the Americans and this insurance thing, all of that is controlled by the West. So whenever you have this oil shipment coming through, you need to acquire insurance for it. For whatever reason, if something goes wrong, you will be reimbursed the money. If there is an accident, if the oil tanker is diverted, if somebody else, if some pirates steal it, or whatever can go wrong, if something goes wrong and you don't receive the oil, then it will be reimbursed. That's why you buy insurance. The insurance providers are all Western. And if India goes ahead with this, the West will not be willing to insure these oil supplies to India. And if there is no insurance, then the oil will not be available. Of course, India can do some circumvention of this. Um, you know, there are some shadowy tankers available that don't belong to any nation, then which can be acquired without any insurance and all that. But it's much more high risk. It's risky. So, because India has not invested in its own national fleet of oil super tankers, that's why India is now facing this conundrum. So, the thing is, okay, you buy oil at whatever price you want, but we will not insure your oil supplies. So, you will not be able to um, use Western tankers or whatever. So, they're trying to make things very difficult for India. Yeah. So that's the situation India is in right now. So what does India do about this? Do the Russians have enough tankers to send to India? But even if something happens, then India will lose money. Yeah. Or do we cooperate with the Chinese? Will the Chinese be willing to cooperate? So that's the kind of situation India is facing right now. So India and Russia want to trade without any external interference. India wants to buy. I think, if I am not mistaken, Russia is now the number two or number three supplier of oil to India. Maybe the number one. I'm not sure. It was not even in the top 10, but now it's in the top 3. That's how much oil India is buying from Russia, which has been the lifeline for Russia. Yeah. And that's how the Russians have been able to ensure that they don't have to go begging to China. And that's why the Russians are still an independent, de facto, a genuinely independent nation. The Chinese have not been able to make Russia their vassal state because of the Indian purchases of enormous amounts of Russian oil. Now, this situation is around the corner. So, India will have to find a solution to that. So, that's where we are. So, India will insist that it's going to buy oil at whatever price it decides or it negotiates with Russia. The Americans are no one to dictate. They have no right to dictate to us what price cap to use and all that. But now this new spanner has been thrown in the works. So, let's see in what direction things go. But yeah, it's complicated right now, and India will have to find a solution to this problem. Okay, Vinu says, please tell about the new North Korean missile test. Is it aimed at Japan or the US? Is North Korea planning a new nuclear test? Right. I think 2 or 3 days ago, the North Koreans tested a ballistic missile, an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM. So, what's the definition of an ICBM? I think it's a missile. It's a ballistic missile that has a range of more than, I don't know, 6,000 kilometers, 7,000 kilometers. I'm not sure what exactly it is. It's a missile that's able to that you can fire from one continent and you can hit a different continent with it. It's a missile with an extended range. Minimum, I would say 5,000 kilometers. Most likely, I would say that an ICBM, from my perspective, should have a range of at least 8,000 kilometers. That's how I would classify a missile as an ICBM. Anyhow, the North Koreans recently tested, like 2 or 3 days ago, a new missile. They've been testing lots of missiles, short range missiles, but this latest test was that of an ICBM. So it was an ICBM with a looping trajectory. It rose about 6,000 kilometers plus above the surface of the Earth, and it splashed down in the sea. Let's take a look at the map, as always. Where's the map? Let's put the map on the screen. So let's go to Korea. You have South Korea, you have North Korea. Yeah, as you can see, east of North Korea, you have the Sea of Japan, and then you have Japan itself. So the missile, I think, it splashed down in the ocean approximately. One second. Approximately 1,000 kilometers away from where it was launched. So it splashed down. Its impact in the ocean was approximately 1,000 kilometers from the point of from where it was launched, and it rose about 6,000 plus kilometers above the surface of the Earth. So if you do the simple, mathematical calculations, it is basically apparent that the range of the missile is in excess of 10,000 kilometers. So this ballistic missile seems to be an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, one that is capable of targeting the United States. So let's see what is the distance from, let's say, the Korean peninsula to, let's say, California. It's about 9,600 kilometers. And so this missile definitely has a range of more than 10,000 kilometers. Some publications are saying that it has a range of about 15,000 kilometers. In that case, it would be the Hwasong 17 missile, which is an enormous missile. It's a two-stage missile, if I'm not mistaken, with liquid fuel. So liquid fuel missiles need to be prepared because liquid fuel is hard. It has to be kept at a very low temperature and so on. So it's a liquid fuel missile with two stages. It's an enormous missile, maybe the largest missile in the world, with a range of about 15,000 kilometers, in case it is the Hwasong 7 that was tested. So these ICBM tests are only aimed at the US. Because if you want to target Japan, you can use an intermediate range or short range ballistic missile or a cruise missile. I'm not sure the North Koreans have cruise missiles, but they do have ballistic missiles of short and medium ranges. So you don't need to test a 15,000 kilometer range missile if you want to target Japan. So it's clear that the target is the US, and it's a message that they're sending to the US that your entire nation is within range of our ballistic missile. So this new missile test, in case it was that 15,000 kilometer range missile, it was aimed at the United States. Obviously, these missiles can also be used to target China. So that's always something that we have to keep in mind. That, look, North Korea is a Chinese client state. Let's understand that. It is a nation, it's a regime, it's a dictatorial regime that is propped up by the Chinese. If you study the history of the Korean War and all that, whatever ensued after that, it was essentially a conflict between the Western bloc, the US-led bloc, and the USSR-led bloc. At that time, China was very close to the USSR. So the Soviets assisted China in this conflict in Korea. And so that's how this peninsula, the Korean peninsula, was partitioned between North Korea and South Korea. That's what the English-speaking empire does everywhere it goes. Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, India, Pakistan, the fragmentation of the Indian subcontinent, the partition of the Korean nation, and so on. And South Korea is a US client state. It's a US vassal state. It's under permanent US occupation. So North Korea is a Chinese vassal. It's a Chinese client state. And this missile test, this ICBM test, was aimed at the US. It was aimed at sending a message to the US. And it's essentially a Chinese sock puppet that the Chinese are telling the US that we have multiple ways of targeting you. Now, is North Korea planning a new nuclear test? So if I recall correctly, the North Koreans have done, I think, 6 nuclear tests thus far in the past, I don't know, a decade or so, right? And I heard that they may be getting ready for a new 7th nuclear test. It's possible. So we don't quite know if it happens. I'm sure it will be announced with great fanfare on North Korean media, and we will come to know about it. And obviously, if you have tracking stations, you can detect the seismic signature of a nuclear test, and you can actually even calculate the yield of the nuclear device and so on. So once it happens, we will know it. I believe they could possibly be getting ready for a new nuclear test. Obviously, if you're testing ballistic missiles, you should also show that you are capable of you have nuclear weapons that you can use as warheads for those missiles. So it's possible that a new nuclear test may be in the offing, maybe sometime soon. Let's see. Let's wait and watch, and we will know. Okay, Swarup Vaidya says rising tensions between two of NATO's biggest militaries are driving fears of the first war between two NATO alliance members. What will be the US's or NATO's role if a war begins between Greece and Turkey? This is a flashpoint that most people are not paying attention to right now. Let's take a look at the map. Where's the map? Over here. Okay, let's see. We know where India is. We know how to orient ourselves. Go west, 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 west. Go to the Mediterranean region, and that's where you have Turkey and Greece. So, what's happening here? So, Greece and Turkey have a very nasty history. A history that goes back to the Ottoman occupation of the Anatolian Peninsula. The entirety of Anatolia, which is the major portion of Turkey, the peninsular region between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, this region is called Anatolia. For the past 3,000 or so years ago, it was Greek. The city of Troy is on the western coast of Anatolia, on the Aegean Sea, and so on. Then the Turks occupied Anatolia gradually, beginning about, 800 years or so ago. Yeah, they were fleeing from the great armies of the great Mongol conqueror Genghis Khan, and that's why they came south from Central Asia and they entered Anatolia and they entered European history essentially. And then they slowly conquered parts of Anatolia, and then they conquered the whole of Anatolia, and eventually you had the Ottoman Empire that conquered parts of Europe as well. It was a very large empire. Yeah, so that's the history. And Greece was under Ottoman occupation for a significant period of time. The Greeks don't like Turkey for obvious reasons. I'll not go into the history. If you're interested, look it up. I think it makes sense what kind of atrocities would have been perpetrated on the Greeks. Yeah. So even in the late 19th century, the city of Thessaloniki was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was then called Salonika. And then there were many wars between Greece and Turkey, including in the 1920s, the Turkish War of Independence, in which Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was able to evict the Western coalition out of Turkey and create an independent nation of Turkey. So Greece and Turkey, they have this blood hatred, this blood enmity. Many Turks actually have Greek ethnicity. And the reason for that, if you want to know, please study it yourself. Yeah, I'll not go into that right now. No need to create controversies unnecessarily at this point. So Greece and Turkey are enemies. Understand that. Greece and Turkey are actually mortal enemies who find themselves both part of NATO, strangely enough. So that's the thing which I keep talking about, that the real major power in Western Europe and Southern Europe is the US. That's the real major power in Europe, in especially Western and Southern Europe. It's the US that's the major power. They have kept this continent more or less peaceful. Obviously, they have done some mischief here and there. You can look it up. So that's why these two enemy nations are part of this US-led coalition, NATO. Now, what is happening? So now, why are we seeing these tensions between these two nations, right? So that's the history. Now Greece and Turkey are now becoming more and more, this relationship is becoming more and more tense. Tensions are rising. What is exacerbating the rising of the tensions? That we have to understand. Something must be happening, right? That is causing the tensions to rise. What is happening is the question. And who is causing this to happen? Let's see. Let us see. Let's put something. So before I tell you why the tensions are rising, let me show you an example of the rising tensions. This is just this week. Mr. Erdogan was in Bali for the G20 summit, and he threatened Greece. Like I said yesterday, Erdogan repeats threat against Greece during G20. The Turkish president warned the neighboring country Greece that he could invade it suddenly one night. What a thing to say. What a thing to say. Huh? He told reporters that Turkey can come suddenly one night and that its neighbor should mind its place and remember the history. Remember the history. Remember what we did to you, what we have done to you for centuries. mind your place, and we can come suddenly one night, any night we can come, and things will go really bad for you. So now let me explain why these tensions are rising. Why is Mr. Erdogan so angry? Let's understand. Here is one example. Do you see this? Turkey condemns US decision to lift Cyprus arms embargo. Let's understand where is Cyprus. Let's go back to the map. Where is Cyprus, and what does Cyprus have to do with all this? So Cyprus is this island here. You see this island here? It is west of Lebanon and south of Turkey, Anatolia. This island has historically been a Greek island. During the Ottoman occupation, there were lots of people who were converted to the Ottoman religion. And northern Cyprus is now, in the 1970s, the Turks invaded the island of Cyprus, and they currently occupy the northern, let's say, quarter or third of the island. There is this dashed line that you see over here on the map. It's like a line of control, yeah, between the Greek held island parts of the island, which is southern Cyprus, and the Turkish held part, which is northern Cyprus. And Turkey has a military presence on Cyprus. There is a significant Turkish military presence on Cyprus. Yeah. And the Americans have had a policy for the past 30, 40, 35 years or so to not interfere in this dispute. Yeah. And the Americans had an arms embargo on Cyprus, which means that they had a policy of not selling any arms to Cyprus, which means the Greek Cyprus. And now what's happened? They have changed that policy. They have decided to lift the Cyprus arms embargo, which means they are arming the Greek held portion of the island against the Turkish held portion of the island. So if there are tensions rising, who is creating the rising of the tensions? It's the US. Now we have to understand why they're doing this as well. So this is one thing. Yeah. So the Americans have fully lifted the weapons embargo on the divided island of Cyprus starting in 2023. The Turks said it would start an arms race and so on. So they are selling various weapons and so on. The Americans are. Let's see what is written here. Let's take a look at a different article to understand what the Americans are arming the Cypriots with. Yeah, this is an example of the weaponry that the Americans are selling to Cyprus. Greece receives more M117 Guardian armored safety vehicles from the US. So the US government plans to supply more than around 1,200 armored vehicles to Greece by the end of this year, 2022, and so on. So that will bolster the Greek military, and this, I think, is in Greece. So understand this. The Americans are sending arms to Cyprus, the Greek held portion of Cyprus. They are arming it against the Turkish held portion of Cyprus. And they are also sending significant supplies, large supplies of these armored vehicles to mainland Greece itself. Yeah. So the Americans are strengthening the Greek military and the Greek military capabilities, and the only enemy Greece has is Turkey. That's what's happening. That is what is causing these tensions to rise. Let's see some more. Let me put that article back on the screen. Is this the article, or is it a different article? I should see. Let's see the previous one. Let's see where the Americans are. Okay, let's see this third article. Let me put a different article. A third article. Here we are. So this is an article in maybe a Turkish publication, right? And the Americans are saying that they are arming Greece as a precaution against Russian activities. That's what the Americans are saying. And there is this place called Alexandroupoli port, which is very close to the Turkish border, where there is a significant influx of American weapons, and there is a significant militarization of this port done by the Americans. The Americans say it is aimed at Russia, This place received 14 times more military supplies from the US in 2021 than in previous years. A dramatic increase that cannot be solely explained by the Ukraine war. The Americans are also providing Greece with F-35 fighter planes, and they have refused to provide those fighter planes to Turkey. They have refused to provide those fighter planes to Turkey. So these are the kind of things that are happening. So it is American activities that are exacerbating and creating these tensions between Turkey and Greece. Yes. And so that's why Mr. Erdogan is so unhappy. That's why he's all riled up, and that's why he's making threats to Greece. That remember your place in history, remember the past, what we have done to you, and we could come and invade you one night. It could happen. So it is a statement that he's making against Greece and also against the Americans who are arming Greece. Now, why is the United States arming Greece? The United States is arming Greece, and the lag begins. The US is arming Greece against Turkey and also to some extent against Russia. If you see the map, then Greece is not really that far from Russia. Greece is a major nation on the Aegean Sea, and it is the sea that connects the Black Sea with the Mediterranean Sea, and Russia is not very, very far off, and Greece also had various tensions in the past with Russia. So the Americans are using that as an excuse to arm Greece. We also know that the Turks have in the past bought weapons systems from Russia, including the S-400 anti-missile system. So, and because the Turks bought this S-400 system from the Russians, that's why the Americans refused to sell the F-35 fighter plane to Turkey. So there are tensions between the US and Turkey, and the fact that the Americans are arming Greece is a continuation of these tensions. So it's a message that they are sending to Turkey. And we also have to remember that there are a number of US nuclear weapons on Turkish soil, and these nuclear weapons are aimed at Russia. So it is a very complicated situation that we are in. It's a complicated situation. But Turkey is slowly moving eastwards. Turkey, see, Mr. Erdogan has imperial ambitions. He essentially wants to recreate the Ottoman Empire. Yes. He has already tried to invade Syria. There are portions of Syria that are occupied, small portions of Syria that are occupied by Turkish troops or have been in the past. Turkey was closely aligned with ISIS during the ISIS disaster in the Middle East. Well, ISIS is a whole different story, but that was there. Yeah. And Turkey has imperial ambitions of its own. It wants to become an empire in its own right. It wants to assume the global leadership of the Islamic world, which will bring it into conflict with the US. Its ambitions are not compatible with US ambitions. Yeah. So it is natural for Turkey to slowly drift away from NATO. But since we have US nuclear weapons on Turkish territory, it means you have US armed personnel also on Turkish territory, which complicates the situation. And yet Turkey is nowadays threatening Greece with war. It could actually happen. The Turks may at some point in time decide to attack Greece, which would be a very dangerous thing for them to do, because the Americans are in a position to destroy Turkey if the Turks do that. So that's what it is. So everything is not well in NATO. Most likely, we will not see a war between Greece and Turkey anytime soon, but the tensions exist, and the tensions are getting worse. It's the Americans who are making the tensions worse. It's also the reason for that is also because Turkey has its own ambitions. It does not want to stay an obedient vassal of the US. It also wants to become a major player in the world. So all of this is caused by the visible, gradual decline of US hegemony worldwide. The US is now perceived to be a declining power, which is why Turkey is raising its head and saying that I have my own ambitions and I will do things and I will not obey all the dictates of the US. And that's what the Saudis are also doing. And various other nations will now feel like doing that as well. The Germans are unhappy. The Germans are unhappy because they can no longer acquire Russian gas, which they were getting for so cheap. Nord Stream has been destroyed. I know. I think we know who did that, right? And so on. So it's a complicated situation. Who's funding Turkey? Most likely, there are, well, the Turks have their own economy, of course. They have weapons that they sell to the world, and obviously there are funds coming in. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Saudi Arabia don't have the best relationship. Just like Saudi Arabia and Iran don't have the best relationship, Saudi Arabia and Turkey don't have the best relationship because both are major powers, and Turkey has imperial ambitions. Saudi Arabia is perceived to be globally, from the world's perspective, to be the home of Islam, because the two holiest sites of Islam, Mecca and Medina, are in Saudi Arabia. Turkey doesn't like this. Turkey wants to reclaim the position of the great leader of the Islamic world, the great caliph, the caliphate, right? The last caliphate was the Ottoman Caliphate, based out of Constantinople, Istanbul. They would like that position. They would like to reclaim that position. But right now, Saudi Arabia has that position. So that's why there is this rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that is the complicated situation where we are in right now. I personally don't see a war breaking out anytime very soon, because if the Turks attack Greece, the Americans will defend Greece, and the Americans will not tolerate that sort of action by one of the nations they consider to be their vassal state. So yeah, very complicated situation, and tensions are rising within NATO. And there's this. Hirsch asks, after the Turks have accused USA of bomb blast and them not allowing Finland and Sweden into NATO. Can US think of kicking Turkey out of NATO? What changes can be expected to be made in foreign policy against Turkey by India? Okay, let's address the bigger thing. That's a good question, right? So recently there was this bomb blast, very unfortunate, in Istanbul, in Constantinople, Istanbul, in one of the major crowded marketplaces or tourist spots or whatever. And I'm not sure how many people lost their lives. Very unfortunate, but that's what happened. It was a suicide bomb, and the Turks were able to capture at least one person, a lady, a female, whom they've accused of being one of the people involved in this terrorist attack. And they say that this person who they have captured was a member of the PKK. It's a Kurdish rebel armed force or whatever. They wish to liberate Kurdistan from Turkish clutches. So if you look at the map, what is Kurdistan? Kurdistan is a state that doesn't exist. The region between Turkey, eastern Turkey, northwestern Iran, and northern parts of Iraq and Syria are the homelands of the Kurdish people. The Kurdish people are an Indo-Iranian people. Okay, they are all converted to Islam now, but their language is not Arabic. It's not a Semitic language. It's an Iranian language, they say, the Kurdish language. And their culture, their old culture was very different from the Arabic or Semitic culture. So the Kurds, and one of the major Islamic historical figures, Salahuddin Ayyubi, was a Kurd. He was born in Tikrit in northern Iraq. Yes, if I'm not mistaken, it was Tikrit, which is also the birthplace or hometown of Saddam Hussein al-Tikriti. Anyhow, that's I'm digressing. So Kurdistan is this region which is divided between multiple nations, between Turkey, between Iran, between Iraq, and parts of Syria as well. The Yazidis also live in some of these territories. So the Kurds have been fighting for a very long time, for decades, if not centuries, for a homeland of their own, a nation state of their own. Right now, the territory is divided up between different nations, and they all are persecuted in all these different nations. The Iranians persecute the Kurds. The Turks persecute the Kurds. So do I would expect. Okay, I'll talk about only Iran and Turkey. I'll not talk about Iraq and Syria. So there is Kurdish persecution in Iran as well as in Turkey. They have been fighting what they call a freedom fight. They are freedom fighters in Turkey. There's an organization called the PKK, and the Turks have said that this person who was arrested by them in connection with the bomb blast that happened recently was a member of PKK. Now, PKK is an organization that the Turks say has been funded by the United States. So when the US officially uh, sent a message of condolence to the Turks, to Turkey, in response to the bomb blast, the Turks rejected the American condolences officially. Yeah. So they are indirectly accusing the Americans of having a hand in this terrorist attack in Constantinople, in Istanbul. So once again, you are seeing increasing tensions between Turkey and the United States. And of course, like Harsh has pointed out, the Turks have been refusing to allow Finland and Sweden to join NATO. So Finland, I think, has made the application to join NATO. I'm not sure about Sweden, but yeah, NATO wants to expand. But the thing is that it has to be any nation, when it applies to join NATO, all the member states of NATO have to agree to this unanimously. That's the deal. And Turkey is refusing to accept this. And the Americans obviously would want Finland and Sweden and whoever else to join NATO. So yeah, more tensions between the US and Turkey. So the Americans, in response to all these activities by Turkey, are arming Greece. They've started arming Greece, they've started arming Cyprus, and this is all aimed at Turkey. If you arm Greece, Greece has only one major enemy nation, which is Turkey. If you arm southern Cyprus, that is aimed at northern Cyprus, which is occupied currently by Turkey. So these are all actions that are hostile to Turkey. These are all actions that negatively affect Turkey's national security. Same like America arming Pakistan, which can only be aimed at India. Similar to that, right? So there are all these tensions happening between the US and Turkey. So the question is, what changes can be expected? Will the US think of kicking Turkey out of NATO? The US, I don't think, will think of kicking Turkey out of NATO. They will think of squeezing and pressurizing Turkey more, because Turkey is a very valuable piece of territory. It's a great territory if you want to contain Russia. The Turks would like to make things better, to see Turkey-Russia relations get better. They obviously bought the S-400 missile system from Russia, which was very much something that displeased the Americans, and that's why the Americans refused to sell the F-35 fighter plane to Turkey. So Turkey is trying to align with Russia to a certain extent, and the Americans will do their best to prevent this from happening. So they will not give up on Turkey. They will keep Turkey a member of NATO, and they will pressurize it more and more. They will use every means at their disposal, every lever that they have in their hand at their disposal, to pressurize Turkey and make Turkey accede to their demands and make Turkey behave. That's what I see happening. So I think tensions will rise between the US and Turkey. Let's say they expel Turkey from NATO, then the very strategic straits, the Turkish straits, will no longer be under US control. The Strait of the Dardanelles and the Strait of Bosphorus. These two straits are incredibly important from a geostrategic perspective, because they are two choke points that connect the Black Sea with the Mediterranean. Two choke points, not one. Yeah. So any Russian activity in this region, naval activity, has to pass through these straits. So if the Russians are sending, let's say, a submarine or an aircraft carrier or a destroyer to the Mediterranean Sea from the Black Sea Fleet, it will have to pass through these straits. So and the rule is that these vessels have to be completely visible and above the surface of the water when they pass through this region. So the Americans, if they control these two straits, these two choke points, they have an incredible amount of control and leverage and advantage in this region, which is why they cannot afford to let Turkey slip out of NATO. And of course, they have US military personnel on Turkish territory and US nuclear weapons on Turkish territory, which are aimed at Russia. So they have their claws deep inside Turkey, and I don't see them wishing to let Turkey leave NATO. Yeah. So yeah, that is the game that is being played in NATO, in Europe. What changes can be expected to be made in foreign policy against Turkey by India? India will try and ensure that India-Turkey relations will remain at a reasonably even keel, no major tensions. Yeah, the Turks keep on making this noise of supporting Pakistan and all that, but they have their own national interest in mind. They have their own problems to solve in their own geographical region. Whatever support they are doing for Pakistan is more like lip service. They, like I said, they wish to take on the mantle of the leader of the Islamic world, and one of the ways of doing it is to support a nation like Pakistan. Uh, if they are actually arming Pakistan in some way, that would be a whole different thing. So India and Turkey, we have never had very good relations. Yeah, and I don't see relations becoming great in the future. But India, I'm sure, will try to make sure that relations don't deteriorate too much. So I don't see Turkey being a very major factor in Indian foreign policy. It is obviously an important nation in Europe, in the Middle East region, in the Mediterranean region. So India has to keep an eye on whatever is happening with Turkey. But I don't see any major shift in foreign policy from India's perspective vis-a-vis Turkey happening anytime soon, unless something drastic happens, which most likely won't in the near future. Uh, Gautam says, I've heard you talk about how Pakistan will eventually return to India. My question is, do we really need Pakistan, or should we just focus on the POK region only so that transit to Central Asia becomes easy? How will Pakistan, with such a radicalized society and a strong hate towards Indian culture, reunite with India amicably? Good question. Let's go to the map because that will help us understand the situation. So yes, I have said this multiple times that Pakistan will eventually return to India. When I say eventually, I mean we're talking about 100-year horizon. It's not going to happen next week, next month, next year, next 10 years. We would like to first see Pakistan, the Pakistani army, to be removed as a factor from this region. And the ideal situation is that without any warfare, without any violence, uh, Sindh should be allowed to become free, Balochistan should be allowed to become free, Pakistani Punjab can become free, and the Pashtunistan region should maybe reunite with Afghanistan. That's the ideal situation. And then slowly we can think of, in the long term, reunite Pakistan, these various parts of Pakistan with India, because this is Indian territory. It has been Indian territory for at least 10,000 years. It is an integral part of India's cultural and civilizational ethos and our territory. It is our heritage that has been stolen from us, this territorial heritage. The Indus River is an integral part of India. India is incomplete without Sindhu Desh, without the Sindhu River, without all these regions which have been part of our territory historically. Peshawar, Purushpur, Quetta, and so on and so forth. So eventually it will reunite with India. It's not going to happen soon. It cannot happen soon. Like Gautam is saying, the Pakistani society is deeply radicalized, and they have this deep hatred for Indian culture. It doesn't make sense to reunite these regions of Pakistan with India, even if Pakistan breaks up in the future. It doesn't make sense. It's going to cause huge problems for them and for us as well. We don't want that. The question is, do we really need Pakistan? We do need to reunify India with these territories that were excised from India by the British. We do need to do it in the long term, over 100-year horizon, because these are our ancestral territories. This is our heritage. We cannot just let it go. It is not right to let it go. It is an integral part of India. It will be reunified when the time is right. So yes, we do need Pakistan, but not yet, and not now. Right now, like Gautam says, we should focus on the POK region, POK, POJK, and Gilgit Baltistan. We need to focus on that, because because when we reacquire POJK and Gilgit Baltistan, we will once again have a direct land route with Afghanistan. And through Afghanistan, we will be able to, first of all, help the people of Afghanistan, help them out, and also have a clear open route to Central Asia and to Europe through Afghanistan. Yes. So that's why the immediate focus should be, let's say, in the next 10 years, on reacquiring POJK, Pakistan occupied Jammu and Kashmir, including Gilgit Baltistan, and maybe some other parts of Pakistan, whatever we need, because this region, the Wakhan corridor region, is very highly mountainous. It's not feasible. It's not very easy to build railway lines or roads through that region. So maybe we can also acquire some other territory that is temporarily part of Pakistan, closer to mainland Afghanistan, and so on. So initially, we need to focus in the immediate future, next 10 years, hopefully, on reacquiring POJK. That needs to become part of, to be reunified with India at the earliest. That way, we will be able to have a direct land route to Afghanistan and through Afghanistan to Central Asia and Europe. That will be great. That's what India has been cut off from. That was the reason why the British supported Pakistan in their attempt to capture Kashmir, to cut India off from Central Asia. India has always had these long trade routes and connections with Central Asia, and for the past 70 years, we have been deprived of that. So the first thing is to recapture, reunify POJK, and in the long run, over a hundred or so year horizon, we will reintegrate Pakistan with the motherland, India. Right. Daniel Nicholson says, harboring superpower ambitions demands geopolitical assertion that sees no right or wrong. Correct. There's no right or wrong in geopolitics. India's neighbors are more nuisance than help for us. Do you think our ambitions could get a shot in the arm if we annexed neighboring nations that went against us once? We become a double-digit trillion-dollar economy, means a $10 trillion economy. That would also effectively convey a message to less than friendly nations to not mess with India. Thank you. Look, you cannot learn how to sprint before you learn how to walk. So the first order of business is to reach the $10 trillion mark, GDP. Yeah. Once you do that, I do not see any need to annex neighboring nations. Let's look at the geography of the Indian subcontinent. Which are the nations that have historically been part of India? We have Pakistan, Afghanistan, yes, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and thereabouts. Yeah. So the question is, will our superpower ambitions get a shot in the arm if we annex neighboring nations? Does India have superpower ambitions? What is a superpower? How do you define a superpower? Here's how I define superpower. In my definition, a superpower is a nation that has control more or less over the entire world, and a nation that can intervene militarily anywhere in the world at 30 to 60 minutes notice. Does India want to be that sort of nation, a global hegemon? I don't think India wants to be a global hegemon. India should obviously be the major, most powerful economy in the world, which has always been the historical position of India. Historically, India has always been the number one economy in the world. India needs to regain that status of the largest economy in the world. And if you are the largest economy in the world, you need the means to be able to protect and safeguard that, which means India needs to have a massive military that is proportional to its economic might. And if India becomes the biggest economy in the world, then India should also be the biggest military in the world. But that doesn't mean, so if you do that, then India will have to secure supply chains and trade routes and all that, which means that India will have to expand its military footprint, especially navally. In other ways, India will have to have a much larger air force, much larger navy to safeguard all those supply chains, trade routes in other nations, nations that supply materials and all those things. So India's economic and military and naval and air force footprint will need to grow proportionate to its economy. But that doesn't require annexing neighboring nations. Let's talk about, let's say, Sri Lanka. Will India need to annex Sri Lanka in the future? I don't think so. Sri Lanka is anyway a friendly neighboring nation. We have more or less the same culture, same everything, just like Nepal. Why can't we have the kind of relationship we have with Nepal? We don't need to annex Nepal. We have an open border with Nepal. The people of Nepal have the right to come to India and live in India as long as they want and work in India as long as they want. They essentially have almost the same rights as Indian citizens, and vice versa. The only thing is that the Nepalese cannot vote in Indian elections. But the Nepalese people have the right to serve in the Indian armed forces, because we see Nepal as the same people as us and the same nation, more or less. The same people, the same heritage as us. We could have a similar relationship with Sri Lanka. Why not? Without having to actually annex the nation. So we could create, like they have the EU with open borders, we could create a subcontinental union similar to that, and maybe expand it beyond to other friendly nations. Maybe in the future we could add Myanmar and Thailand and Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam to that, maybe even Indonesia, and so on. We can think of it in that manner. So without actually annexing other nations, we can integrate those nations with our economy and have more or less open borders with friendly nations. Hopefully even westwards in the future. Hopefully in the next 100 years, even with what is now Pakistan, what is now Afghanistan, and maybe even with our real neighbors, the Parsis, the Iranians. We could have that once things are better in the world. Yeah. So I would say India needs to raise its economic might. India needs to maybe in the next 50 years become the world's largest economy, which will necessitate India to have the world's largest military and most powerful military as well. And we can use that military for good instead of using it for bullying other nations and creating vassal states. We can use it for actual good in the world. That's what India has always been. India has always been a force of good rather than evil. India has never been a colonizer. India has always given more than it has taken. It has never taken anything from other nations. So that's what India should aspire to be. Instead of becoming a new bully like the Americans, like the Anglo-Saxon Empire, or like what the Chinese wish to be, we could be a force for good, but be the largest force in the world. So that's how I see our future foreign policy once we become a significant military and economic power. That's the kind of superpower India should aim to be, not a hegemon, but a force for good. Chiching says, why was Delhi chosen as the capital of India? What were the reasons behind that? This is a great question. Nobody's asked this thus far. Very good question. So yes, India's capital city is Delhi. Now, if you go back deep in India's history, like really deep, not very deep, but reasonably deep, go back to the time of the Mahabharata. The capital of the Pandavas was called Hastinapur, and there was another major city called Indraprasth. Well, Indraprasth is the site of present day Delhi. So Indraprasth, there is this region, this part of Delhi which is called Indrapat, which is the geographical site of the historical Indraprasth from the Mahabharata days. So it's a very old place, first of all, Delhi, and it's always been very significant. Later on, during the Tomar dynasty, Delhi was the capital of the Tomar Rajputs, if I'm not mistaken. It was also the capital of Prithviraj Chauhan. Was it? It was always a major city. It was from time to time one of the major cities and one of the centers of power in India. The last Indian emperor who was crowned, when I say Indian, I mean a person who followed Indian culture and traditions. The last Hindu emperor, so to say, was crowned emperor in Delhi. There was Hemachandra Vikramaditya. His army was entirely Pashtuns, like 90% of his soldiers were Pashtuns, but he was crowned the emperor of India, which included Afghanistan, by the way, at that time, in Delhi. So Delhi has from time to time been a major city, and from time to time been the capital of India. Yeah. During the time of, let's say, Chandragupta Maurya, during the Mauryan era, when the Mauryan Empire had unified the subcontinent, at that time the capital of India was Patliputra, which is currently called Patna. Yeah. And even during the Gupta era, when the Gupta Empire had again reunified India, the capital of India was Patliputra, Patna. During the Kushan era, we had two capitals. One was, I think, Mathura. One was Purushpur, Peshawar. Yeah, during Kanishka's time. So India has had various capitals from time to time. When the British when the British occupied India, their capital was Kolkata. Not in the far east of India, but to the east. Yeah, at the time, what is now Bangladesh was also part of India. So their capital was Kolkata. But then they expanded out of Bengal and they were able to capture more or less all of India. Yes. And then they realized that their capital city is in the east of India. It should be a more centralized location, which is why I think it was in 1931 that they made Delhi the capital of India. And they constructed a newer part of the city, which they called New Delhi. And that's why they made this more centrally located city the capital of British India. At that time, it was centrally located because what is now Pakistan was also part of India at the time. It was undivided India. It was not partitioned India. So Delhi was more or less to some extent in the center. Ideally, you want a city in Madhya Pradesh or something. Yeah. But yeah, so that's what they did. So that is the main reason why Delhi was chosen as the capital of India. And the British had also partitioned Bengal into East Bengal and West Bengal along religious lines, and there were all these religious conflicts and riots and all things, tensions in Bengal, in Calcutta. That's why they wanted to leave the place and leave and come to Delhi. Yeah, so these are the reasons why they made Delhi the capital of British India. And after India's so-called independence, the people to whom power was transferred were all Anglophiles, and they believed in continuing whatever the British had done in India. So they changed nothing, and Delhi remained the capital of India. Maybe in the future, we should think of a new capital, maybe a brand new capital somewhere in real central India, or maybe going back to, maybe let's say Patliputra, or maybe to Peshawar, Purushpur, or maybe Mathura. We've had many great cities in the past. Maybe Pune. Pune was a capital of India during the Maratha Empire time. You know, so there have been many various cities that in the past have served as the capital of India, and Delhi is just one of them. There's nothing apart from that really special. Some people, what they say, they say that Delhi has a very bad history. It is a cursed city, some people say, from the days of the Mahabharata itself. And obviously this like, it's a city that brings bad luck. When the barbarian Timur invaded India, he conducted a horrific massacre in Delhi, in which at least 100,000 innocent men, women, and children were butchered in just one day in the streets of Delhi. The city was awash in blood. So it's got a very bad, very dark history, this city. And some people say it's not appropriate for a city like that to be the capital of India. Maybe they're right. I don't know. I would say that maybe, and so there are many reasons for which would justify India getting a new capital city, maybe somewhere in the actual center of India. But yeah, that's for the political class to decide. But I think that explains why Delhi was chosen as the capital of India. It's a very good question. Pranab says, recently the Prime Minister of India said about Indonesia that Indonesia is currently 90 nautical miles from India. I think they watch they watch a show. No, I don't know about that. Anyway, so what's my take on our neighborhood status of Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia? Why don't we consider them as neighbors, but we consider Maldives to be our neighbor? Let's take a look at the map. Yeah. So the Prime Minister said that Indonesia is about roughly 90 nautical miles from India. This is the island of Great Nicobar, right? Which is India's southernmost territory. And over here you have Sabang and you have Banda Aceh. Let's see the distance between the Great Nicobar Island and the northern tip of Indonesia. That's 176 kilometers. You divide that by 2, it's about 8. Yeah, it's roughly 90 or so nautical miles. Yeah. So Indonesia is less than 200 kilometers from India. And yet nobody in India thinks of Indonesia as a neighbor. There is something called a maritime neighbor. See, Sri Lanka obviously doesn't currently have a land connection with India. In the past, we had the great Rama Setu. Today, there is the Palk Strait, the Gulf of Mannar, the Palk Strait, which lies between mainland India and mainland Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka is currently not connected with India, and yet we think of Sri Lanka as our neighboring country. It's a maritime neighbor. Just the same way, Indonesia is also very much a maritime neighbor of India. And similarly, so is Thailand. Most of Thailand is over here, but some of it is over here. Let's say the resort island of Phuket. How far is it from Great Nicobar Island of India? Let's see. From here to here, let's measure the distance. It's about 500 kilometers. So it's about 500 kilometers from India across the Andaman Sea. So why is it not considered to be a neighboring country of India? I consider Thailand to be a neighboring country of India. But that's not the way we are taught geography. When you go to school, you learn geography. They give you a set of nations that you have to memorize as India's neighbors. The first nation they teach you is Pakistan. So that's why people are not taught how to think, critical thinking. Yeah. And that's why nobody in India thinks of Thailand as a neighboring nation or Indonesia as a neighboring nation, even though they are. So from my perspective, India has a number of nations that are our neighbors from the perspective of land borders. Tibet is one, Nepal is one, Bhutan is one, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and we have Afghanistan, Pakistan temporarily. Actually, Iran should be our neighbor once Pakistan is reintegrated. And then we have maritime neighbors, Maldives over here, obviously, which is really far from the coastline of India, and yet we consider it to be a neighbor. So Maldives is one. The Seychelles is another one, which is not really far away. I would also consider Eastern Africa to be our neighbor, Somalia, and Oman and Yemen, and of course these nations, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. So, from my perspective, these are all our neighboring nations. We have a number of maritime neighbors that we don't think about. So, the reason why most Indians don't consider them neighbors is because it's not taught that way in our geography textbooks when we are in school. That's why we don't think about it. Yeah. But these are actually our neighbors. Mona Lisa says, could you tell us, please, why Ukraine and Belarus became two founding members of the United Nations in 1945, even though they were not independent nations at the time in 1945? They were part of the USSR until 1991. Why? How did this happen? What an interesting question. Good question, Mona Lisa. So here's what happened. The United Nations was formed in 1945. At that time, you had the USSR, which had, I don't know how many, 26, 27 nations, republics. So the USSR stands for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So all of these republics, Soviet Socialist republics like Ukraine, like Belarus, like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, like, and so on and so forth. These were all various republics that were constituent members of the USSR. In 1945, there was something called the British Commonwealth. India was part of that. India was still part of the British Empire at the time. It was still illegally occupied by Britain. But you had nations like Australia, which was also owned by the British Crown, like New Zealand, which was also owned by the British Crown, like Canada, which was also owned by the British Crown. It is still actually owned by the British Crown. So these were all members of the Commonwealth, the UK's Commonwealth. So the UK wanted these nations to be individual members, independent members of the United Nations, even though they were actually all ruled from London. Yeah. So Stalin said that this is wrong. How can you do this? You are ruling all these territories from London. So why don't you have just one seat in the UN for the entire British Empire? Why are you, so if you even though you are ruling it all from one place, but you are giving more seats in the UN to these territories, it means you get more votes for yourself. So by doing it that way, the Western powers, the English-speaking powers, were getting more votes in the UN. So they could influence the decisions and proceedings in the UN because they had more seats, more votes. So Stalin said that if you are doing it this way, then every single republic of the USSR should get its own vote in the UN. When he said that, the Americans said that in that case, we want each American state, 50 states, to have a separate seat in the UN. So there was this squabbling that was going on. So as a compromise, it was decided that the USSR will get 2 additional seats in the UN, which is the Ukraine SSR and the Belarus SSR, even though Ukraine and Belarus were part of the USSR. So USSR got 3 seats and 3 votes in the UN, in the United Nations. But it got only 1 seat in the UN Security Council, the permanent 5, the top 5, which is understood, which is understandable. So that's how it happened. That's how Ukraine and Belarus, even though they were part of the USSR, became 2 separate founding members of the UN. Interesting, very interesting story. Okay, Mazar says, why is it that some of the vassal states of the US, like Japan, Germany, etc., are rich, while others, like Pakistan, are poor? Is it in the interest of the US to keep these countries rich or poor, or is it because of their leadership? Okay, why is it so? Why are some nations rich? Why are some nations poor? So Japan was destroyed at the end of the Second World War. By 1945, Japan had been nuked twice. It was totally destroyed, totally flattened, bombed to the ground. Then the Americans occupied Japan. And under American occupation, the Japanese were allowed to rise again. And because of the industriousness and all that of the Japanese people, the hard work and all that, they were able to make Japan a major economy once again. It had become the second largest economy in the world in the 1980s, and it could have actually surpassed the United States. And then some things were done, and Japan's economy was destroyed. It's still a major nation, a very rich and prosperous nation. So Japan was under US occupation. South Korea also was underwent the same process. It was under US occupation. It was also allowed to rise and become prosperous. Germany, etc., were all rebuilt after the destruction of the Second World War under US stewardship. Germany, like Japan and South Korea, is also under US permanent occupation. Okay? And the Americans allowed Germany to become a major industrial power again. It became the powerhouse of Europe, and it was all beneficial to the Americans because the Americans actually occupied Western Europe and controlled Western Europe. And obviously, you have the NATO nations and all that. So, Europe had a high degree of prosperity because they had looted and pillaged and plundered the entire world for 500 years before the Second World War. Africa and India, obviously. The UK obviously had plundered India for centuries. So the European nations produce very little compared to nations in Africa and Asia, and yet they became so prosperous. It's because they stole all the wealth out of the rest of the world. That's why they were prosperous, and that those riches still. Most of those riches and all that wealth still persisted after the Second World War. That's why these nations, the European nations, were rich. Japan rebuilt itself. South Korea rebuilt itself after the Korean War. Europe was already rich. So that's why these vassal states in Europe were already rich. And that's how Japan and South Korea were allowed to become rich. Pakistan is a vassal state, but the US has never occupied Pakistan. They have put a puppet power. They have propped up the dictatorial regime of the Pakistani army and the ISI. The US has never actually physically occupied Pakistan. So Pakistan is a client state, it's a vassal state. It's like many African dictatorships that are also US client states or vassal states, but the US doesn't actually occupy those nations. Yeah. So that's why some client states or vassal states are rich and some are poor. It's not like the US decides that these nations will be allowed to become rich and these will be kept poor. It's not like that. They just use whatever is there available to them to their benefit. And that's how it is done. And I had so many other questions that I had to take, but I think we we are reaching the end of today's session. Let me see if I can take one or two more. Karan Alawat says, what was the Carrington event? And Dungar Singh Chauhan says, how dangerous are solar flares? How severely can they impact life on Earth? Okay, let's talk about solar flares first. So solar flares. So the sun is a star. It's a ball of fluid. It's a ball of gas, but that gas is very dense. The density of the hydrogen gas on the sun it's thicker than water. It's denser than water. Yeah. And the sun is a highly magnetized star. There are these massive, enormously powerful magnetic fields that lie below the surface of the sun, and the sun has this has an atmosphere, the corona, and all that. And these magnetic fields, they create these loops. The magnetic lines of force. You can see these loops in the atmosphere of the sun, and these loops are always changing. They're always interacting with each other, and sometimes they break. And if this happens in the atmosphere of the sun, the sun is always ejecting this solar wind, which causes auroras on Earth. But when one of these magnetic lines of force breaks off, it gives rise to what's called a coronal mass ejection, which is a huge outburst of plasma from the sun's surface. And if it comes in the direction of the Earth, then it can cause something like the Carrington event, which is an event that happened, I think, in 1859. So it was this huge coronal mass ejection that hit the Earth. It impacted the Earth's magnetic field. So when something like this hits the Earth, there is no real effect on life on Earth. It doesn't affect us because most of it is absorbed by the magnetic field of the Earth and the atmosphere. None of this plasma is able to actually reach this surface of the Earth, but you see intense magnetic activity in the form of these auroras. So when the Carrington event happened, it was the most powerful, and this thing is called a geomagnetic storm. So it was the most powerful geomagnetic storm ever recorded. Yeah, you had auroras along the equator, if I'm not mistaken. Typically, you see auroras along the poles, the North Pole and the South Pole of the Earth. But this was so intense that auroras were witnessed near the equator of the Earth. And various telegraph systems they started sparking in the fires and all that because of induced currents that are induced by magnetism and all that. So these solar flares and geomagnetic storms and events like the Carrington event, they will not cause any actual loss of life or any damage to anyone's health, but they can destroy electrical grids, totally destroy electrical grids. So they could knock off electrical grids across the world if something like this happens again, and your laptops and whatever else you use will all get fried, destroyed. And to replace those burnt out, destroyed electrical grids could take months, perhaps years. In cold places, people could die from exposure to cold because there is no electricity available for heating, and so on. And it could destroy satellites around the earth. It could destroy hundreds of satellites. We would be left without any communications. That thing will happen one of these days. It's a statistical certainty. So yeah, so solar flares are dangerous from that perspective. They cannot kill anybody or affect life on earth or make anybody sick, but they can destroy our electrical infrastructure. They could destroy our communications infrastructure. They could destroy satellites, and they could destroy all kinds of equipment on the earth, which could be a disaster, which would destroy economies worldwide, and it could actually kill people from exposure to cold in cold places. So that's why solar flares and geomagnetic storms and coronal mass ejections are potentially very dangerous. All right, let me take a couple of questions from the live chat. I had many questions that I had in queue, but let's take some questions from the live chat right now. Yes. And manufacturing and logistics and much more. Absolutely right. Yes. Okay, Bhavesh says Coco Islands issue. China is constructing an airstrip on one of the islands. So the Coco Islands are two islands in the very north part of the Andamans. Let's take a look at it. I'm sure you all know where the Andaman Islands are. So to the north of the Andaman Islands, you have these two Coco Islands, which belong to India, but the great, magnificent Prime Minister of India, Shri Jawaharlal Nehru gifted them to Burma for whatever reason, for reasons known best to him. So the thing is China constructing an an airstrip on one of these islands? Let us see. Satellite? Do we have satellite? Satellite. Yes, let's see the satellite image. Let's close that. So there are two Coco Islands. The south one has just forests. It's very small. It's about 1 kilometer or so in length. The northern island has an airstrip. It's been around for a long time, this airstrip. And it's got all kinds of infrastructure also. It's very well organized, as you can see. There are residential buildings. There are buildings that look like offices. There is this building which could be a hangar, perhaps, possibly. We don't know. There are other buildings here. There's a whole complex in the north. Yeah. So there is a lot of infrastructure on this island. Very well developed, very well organized, and a significant airstrip. Let's see how long it is. Measure distance from bottom to the top. It's 2.4 kilometers. Let's say 2 kilometers. That is a very significant airstrip. You can land heavy military planes on this island. So this infrastructure has been constructed by the Chinese. The Burmese, many years ago, decades ago perhaps, handed over this island to the Chinese. And the Chinese have developed all this infrastructure on this island. Some of it is military in nature. Some of it, this essentially is a signals intelligence gathering station. They use this place. Where is it? Go back to default. Yeah. So they use this island to eavesdrop on Indian naval and military activity in the Andamans and in the larger Indian Ocean region, in the Bay of Bengal region. Yeah, in the Kalinga Mahasagar region. So that's what's happening. So the Chinese are not building an airstrip on the island. They have already done it long ago. And they use this facility, this infrastructure, for spying on India. That's what is going on. And that is all thanks to the magnificence and generosity of the great Shri Jawaharlal Nehru, the most magnificent Prime Minister of India. All right, let's see some other questions. Let's see some other questions. How would Chanakya have countered terrorism? Well, Chanakya lived in a different time, and he was essentially the most trusted advisor of the Emperor of India. Chandragupta Maurya ruled over large parts of India. His rule was unquestioned. So Chanakya would have dealt with terrorism with a very heavy hand, with an iron fist. He would have smashed terrorism. Those, if he was in India today, in the 21st century, his approach would be different. India is not a very majorly powerful nation today. India is an emerging great power. It's not a superpower, and there are lots of issues in India, internally and externally. So today, Chanakya would have advised a more nuanced approach: hide and bide. Hide your capabilities, bide your time, and do whatever you can stealthily. Yeah. All right. Yes, sir. Somebody remembered you. um, Okay, Atharva says, why do you call nations like France and Germany vassals when America has no administration power over these nations? Yes, America does not administer the nation. These nations have elections. They have their own president. They have their own local government, their own city councils, and all that. Everything is done. They have their own laws, their own legislature. So why do I call them vassals? Because their foreign policy is dictated by the US. They are members of NATO. NATO is owned by the US. They are members of the EU. The EU is the PR front of NATO. EU and NATO are owned by the US. They are controlled by the US. Everything that happens there is controlled by the US. The foreign policy and economic policy of these nations is dictated by the US. France, I would say, has a quasi-independent foreign policy in the sense that they have their own independent military. They have their own nuclear warheads. They have their own submarines that are not controlled by the Americans. Yeah. And they have nuclear warheads of their own. They have significant interest in the Indian Ocean region. But the core foreign policy cannot deviate from US national interests. Same goes for Germany. In the case of Germany, Are bhai, do you even hear me? I said it a few minutes ago. Germany is under permanent US military occupation. It has been so since 1945. There is permanent US military presence in Germany. Military bases that are controlled by the US, that have US military personnel on German territory since 1945. The German constitution was written by Americans. Yeah, technically it was written by Germans, but not a single word is in the constitution that was not approved by the Americans. And when Germany was reunified, it is the US imposed constitution that was extended to Eastern Germany. These are the reasons why I say that nations like France and Germany and every other nation that's part of the EU and every other nation that's part of the NATO, all these nations are vassal states of the US. Yes, they make it look very nice to you. There are elections, they have their own presidents, they have their own law, they have their own legislature. And yet, if you look deep within, if you peel back some layers, you will understand what's really happening. You have to dig a little deeper. Do not look at things superficially. Then you will understand the world. All right? So that's the reason why I always say that France and Germany are vassals of the US. All right, I will take one more question. Let's see. Okay, let's take one question by Shaheen. To what extent can a stellar flyby destabilize the solar system? Is it conceivable that the Toba super explosion happened as a result of the tidal forces from the Scholz star? A stellar flyby means another star. The sun is a star, one of the billions of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And the sun is not sitting in one place. It's moving around the center of the galaxy. At the center of the galaxy, we have this unseen object. It's a supermassive black hole. It's sitting at the center of the galaxy. It's holding the entire galaxy together to a large extent. Yeah, it affects the dynamics of the galaxy and the movements of the stars. So all the stars are doing this merry-go-round around the unseen central supermassive black hole of our galaxy. And from time to time, stars come in close contact. So stars typically never collide, but star systems can come in contact with each other, close to each other, pass near each other. That's called a stellar flyby, which means another star with its star system, with its planets and all that, passes close by to the sun. And about 80,000 or so years ago, there was a star called Scholz's star that came very close to the sun. It is a very small star, but it came very close to the sun. So the question is, how much can, to what extent can such a stellar flyby destabilize the solar system? It's going to have an effect. If a massive object, a massive star passes by the sun, its gravitational pull is going to reconfigure the solar system if it comes too close. Otherwise, it's going to reorient some of the orbits of the planets and asteroids and comets and all that. It can do that. So it's all about gravitation. It's all about gravity. Its gravitational pull will kind of perhaps change the trajectory of the sun itself, and it could possibly end up changing certain orbital configurations of the planets in the solar system. Yeah. So there have been computer simulations done about what effect the flyby of the Scholz star would have had on the sun and the solar system and maybe on the earth, and the various possibilities exist. We're not quite sure of how it went. um, is it conceivable that the Toba super volcano explosion occurred as a result of tidal forces? I think it's unlikely. Tidal forces will happen when you have a gravitating object that's very close to the earth, to the extent that it deforms the surface and the shape of the earth. The moon does that, but there is no other object that comes so close. Even the sun doesn't deform the earth's crust and surface to a significant extent. The sun does have some effect on the tides on earth, but not as much as the moon. So you need to be really close, because gravity is a very weak force. So I don't think the Toba supervolcano explosion happened as a consequence of the Scholz star, but yeah, interesting question. All right. I think I know lots of other questions. I can do it until tomorrow, but I think we will call it a day over here. It's been 2 hours, 8 minutes. So let me end the session over here. Thank you very much, everybody. Yeah, I know there's a football match going on, the World Cup in Qatar. Wonderful. Watch it. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of today's session, to the end of episode 143. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for all your questions. Thank you very much for your viewership. I really appreciate it. And we will continue this next week. Until then, take care, stay healthy, take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye.